The humid air inside the Oak Haven Community Center auditorium hung heavy with the scent of floor wax, old velvet curtains, and the sharp tang of anxiety. It was the kind of nervousness that only exists at competitive events, where children are the pawns and parents are the generals. The annual district piano recital was in full swing, a marathon of Bach Beethoven, and the occasional stumbling rendition of Heart and Soul. The audience was a sea of restless legs and whispering voices, a tapestry of checkered blazers and floral dresses. Everyone was there for one reason, to see if their child was the one who possessed that special spark, or if they were just another kid hitting keys because their parents made them. In the very back row, tucked behind a thick structural pillar that offered a perfect view of the stage but complete shadow from the audience, sat an elderly woman. She was a fixture at these recitals, though nobody knew her name. To the regulars, she was just the quiet lady with the silver hair pulled back in a loose, gentle bun. She always wore the same faded cardigan, buttoned up to the chin, and a long skirt that swept the floor when she walked. Her face was a map of deep wrinkles, etched by decades of smiles and frowns, and her eyes were a soft, cloudy blue that seemed to look at everything and nothing all at once. While other parents tapped furiously on their phones or scribbled notes on judging sheets, this woman sat perfectly still. Her hands, which were spotted with the marks of age and trembled slightly when she lifted her teacup to her lips, rested calmly in her lap. She didn't look at the program. She didn't need to. She listened to every note, every hesitation, every rush of tempo. When a young girl missed a transition in the middle of a Mozart sonata, the old woman didn't shake her head in disappointment like the man next to her. Instead, she closed her eyes for a brief second and let out a small, understanding breath, as if she knew exactly how heavy the weight of expectation felt on small shoulders up front. Near the polished mahogany stage, the atmosphere was entirely different. 3 judges sat at a long table covered in a white cloth. They were important people, or at least they acted like it. There was a woman with sharp glasses who tapped her pen impatiently, a man with a goatee who kept checking his reflection in the grand piano's lid, and the head judge, a tall man named Mr. Vance who treated the recital like a corporate board meeting. They were tired, bored, and eager to get to the intermission so they could drink lukewarm coffee and complain about the talent pool. Just as Vance was about to call the next number, a harried assistant rushed onto the stage, waving a clipboard and looking pale. "We have a problem," the assistant whispered loudly enough for the front row to hear. "Another one?" Vance groaned, rubbing his temples. "What is it now?" "Stage fright." "Broken string?" "Worse," the assistant said. "The Peterson boy. He just threw up in the hallway. His mother is taking him home. He was our finale. We have a 15-minute gap in the program." The audience began to murmur as the delay stretched on. The judges looked at each other in panic. A recital without a finale was like a meal without dessert. It left people feeling cheated. They needed someone to fill the time, someone to play a piece that was impressive enough to end the first half on a high note. But they had run out of students. Mr. Vance stood up, smoothing his suit jacket, and scanned the audience with desperate eyes. He needed a volunteer. He needed an adult who could play, someone who wouldn't embarrass the organization. His eyes swept past the rows of parents, most of whom avoided his gaze like the plague. He didn't want a professional. He just wanted a warm body. Then he spotted her. The old woman in the back? She was sitting closest to the heavy, rented grand piano that sat off to the side of the stage. Vance didn't know her history. He didn't know that 50 years ago, she had walked the halls of the most prestigious conservatories in Europe. He only saw a frail grandmother who probably played nursery rhymes to her grandchildren. To his arrogant mind, she was the perfect solution. She was a human placeholder, someone who would play a simple tune, smile politely, and let them get to intermission. "Excuse me." "Yes, you, in the back," Vance announced, pointing a finger at her. The spotlight followed his hand, blinding the woman for a moment. The audience turned to look. A few people giggled, recognizing the silent observer from the back row. The woman blinked in the sudden light, shielding her eyes with a trembling hand. "We have an opening," Vance said, his voice booming through the mediocre microphone. "You look like you know your way around a piano. Would you mind filling in? Just a short piece to fill the time?" The woman hesitated. She looked at the massive instrument on the stage, a black beast gleaming under the lights. She thought about the arthritis that made her knuckles ache on cold mornings. She thought about how long it had been since she had touched a piano that was actually in tune. But then she looked at the terrified faces of the students in the wings, and the bored, sneering faces of the judges. Slowly, she stood up. Her knees cracked audibly, causing a ripple of suppressed laughter from a group of teenagers in the third row. She walked down the aisle, her steps slow but steady. As she climbed the stairs to the stage, the rustling of her skirt was the only sound in the room. Mr. Vance met her at the piano. With a condescending smile plastered on his face, he felt good about himself. He felt like he was doing a charity act. "Thank you for helping us out, ma'am," he said loudly, ensuring the audience could hear his generosity. "We just need something pleasant to keep the mood up." He reached over to a stack of sheet music left on the piano rack by the previous competitor. It was a thick, intimidating book of advanced repertoire. Vance didn't know much about the music itself, but he knew that the thicker the book, the harder the music. He thought it would be funny to give the old lady a challenge. A little private joke for the judges to show how impossible the music was. He flipped through the pages, his eyebrows raising as he saw the dense forest of black notes. "Ah, here we go," he muttered, pulling a page free. Franz Liszt, very famous. He didn't know that this specific piece, the Transcendental Etude No. 5, was known as Faux Follets, or Will-o'-the-Wisps. He didn't know it required the dexterity of a surgeon and the power of a titan. He just saw the name list and knew it was supposed to be hard. He placed the open book on the stand, not even smoothing out the curled pages. "Just play the first page or two," he whispered to her, leaning in close with a whiff of expensive cologne. "Don't worry about getting all the notes. Just give us some nice sounds to fill the silence." The woman looked at the music. Her eyes ran over the staff, the sharps, the flats, the dizzying runs of notes that jumped from the bottom of the keyboard to the top. For a moment, the air in the room seemed to stop. She recognized the piece instantly. It was an old friend, a relentless foe she had conquered in her youth. It was a piece that demanded everything you had, stripping away any pretense until only the music remained. She looked at Mr. Vance. He was checking his watch. Already mentally dismissing her? "Are you sure you want this one?" she asked softly. Her voice was raspy, unused to speaking loudly. Vance chuckled, waving his hand at the audience. "Oh, don't worry about the difficulty, my dear. Just have fun with it. We aren't looking for perfection here." The woman didn't smile. She didn't nod eagerly. She simply reached out with a weathered hand and straightened the sheet music. She adjusted the bench, sliding it forward until she was the perfect distance from the keys. The piano bench creaked under her weight. Behind her, the audience was settling in, expecting a mediocre, perhaps cute performance. The judges were looking at their phones. The teenagers in the third row were whispering bets on how long it would take her to give up. The woman placed her hands on the keys. They were pale, the veins raised and blue against the skin. To the untrained eye, they looked weak, fragile. But as she hovered her fingers over the ivories, preparing to play the first chord, the trembling in her hands vanished completely. Her fingers curved naturally, finding the familiar shape of the instrument. She sat up straighter, her shoulders dropping, her posture shifting from a frail old lady to something regal, something commanding. The room fell silent, waiting for the first plink of a wrong note. But the silence was about to be broken by something else entirely. The old woman took a deep breath, filled her lungs with the dusty air of the community center, and began to play. The silence that filled the auditorium wasn't the peaceful kind. It was the waiting kind, heavy with unspoken judgment. In the front row, the teenagers who had been giggling stopped shoving each other and leaned forward, elbows on their knees, ready to whisper the moment the old lady hit a wrong note. They were young, full of the certainty that comes from knowing very little about the world. To them, music was a sport, and the old woman on stage looked like she was about to trip at the starting line. One boy, wearing a varsity jacket and a smirk, nudged his friend, and held up 3 fingers, silently betting she would mess up within 30 seconds. The judges sat comfortably in their chairs. The tall man, Mr. Vance, had already picked up his pen again, poised to write a polite, meaningless comment on a sheet of paper he hadn't even looked at yet. He wasn't really listening. In his mind, this was just background noise, a break between the real students who mattered. He was thinking about the sandwich he was going to eat during intermission, or the emails he needed to send once this was over. The woman with the sharp glasses was busy adjusting her necklace. Looking bored, the old woman, however, didn't move for a long moment. She sat on the bench, her back slightly curved, staring at the music stand. To the audience, she looked confused, perhaps trying to decipher the tiny black notes that crowded the page like ants. But in reality, she wasn't looking at the notes at all. She was letting her eyes adjust to the light. She was letting her hands remember the temperature of the keys. She was taking a moment to say goodbye to the quiet, because once she started, there would be no going back. Slowly, she raised her hands. They didn't shake anymore. They hung in the air for a fraction of a second, suspended like birds deciding which way to fly. Then, her fingers came down. The first chord didn't plink. It didn't stumble. It rang out like a bell in an empty valley, clear and loud and perfectly in tune. It was a sound that demanded attention, a sound that seemed to vibrate right through the floorboards and up the legs of the chairs. The boy with the smirk froze, his hand halfway to his mouth. Mr. Vance's pen stopped moving. The sharp intake of breath from the audience was audible, a collective gasp of surprise. She didn't hesitate. There was no fumbling for the next note, no pause to find her place on the page. Her right hand began to move, and suddenly the piano wasn't a wooden box anymore. It was alive. The piece, Faux Follets, or Willow the Wisps, is a terrifying piece of music. It is supposed to sound like flickering lights in a dark swamp, dancing just out of reach. It requires the player to jump their hands up and down the keyboard at a blinding speed, barely touching the keys. If you press too hard, it sounds heavy. If you are too slow, it sounds muddy. It has to be light, impossibly light, like a ghost running over the keys. The audience expected to hear banging. They expected to hear a slow, careful trudging through the notes. Instead, they heard a cascade of water. The old woman's fingers were a blur. Up and down the keyboard they went, faster than the eye could follow. The sound was crystal clear, each note separate but connected in a flow that seemed to have no beginning and no end. It wasn't just fast. It was effortless. She made it look easy, which is the hardest thing to do in the world. In the front row, the teenager who had made the bet slowly lowered his hand. His mouth opened slightly, but no sound came out. He was a piano student himself. He knew how hard this piece was. He had practiced it for months and still couldn't get through the first page without his hands cramping up. And here was this woman, old enough to be his grandmother, playing it with a grace that made it seem like she was breathing. He watched her face, expecting to see a look of concentration or panic. But her expression was calm. Her eyes were half closed, as if she were remembering a dream she had a long time ago. Mr. Vance. The head judge finally put his pen down completely. He leaned forward, his elbows on the table, forgetting all about his sandwich. He was staring at her hands now. He noticed the way her fingers curved, striking the keys with the pads rather than the fingertips, creating a warm singing tone. He noticed the way her wrists moved, fluid and loose, absorbing the shock of the keys, so the sound never became harsh. It was a technique you couldn't learn from a book in a few months. It was a technique born of decades, a way of moving that only comes when the piano becomes an extension of your body. The other 2 judges stopped whispering. The woman with the glasses took them off, as if seeing clearly was somehow an insult to what she was hearing. She turned to Mr. Vance, her eyes wide. She didn't say a word, but she didn't have to. Her face said, "Asterisk, who is this?" Asterisk, the music grew more complex. The melody was jumping from the left hand to the right hand, chasing itself, playful and mocking. The tempo increased. The rhythm was tricky, skipping and hopping, trying to trip the player up. But the old woman never faltered. She was rock solid. She wasn't just reading the music. She was ahead of it. Her hands knew where the notes were before her eyes even saw them. She had memorized the pattern 50 years ago, and her muscles remembered. There was a moment, about a minute in, when the music reached a high point. A series of shimmering trills that filled the entire room. The sound was so bright, so delicate, that it felt like the roof of the community center had been lifted off and replaced with the open sky. The air in the room seemed to change. The tension that had been there before, the boredom, the judgment, the arrogance, just evaporated. No one was checking their phones. No one was coughing. No one was shifting in their seats. 300 people were held in the palm of one hand. The teenagers in the third row had stopped smirking entirely. They sat up straight, watching with a kind of terrified respect. They realized that they were witnessing something they couldn't do. It was a humbling moment for them. Sudden realization that age and appearance meant absolutely nothing in the face of true talent. The boy who had made the bet looked down at his own hands, feeling suddenly very small. Mr. Vance felt a strange sensation in his chest. It was a mixture of embarrassment and awe. He felt ashamed of how he had treated her, how he had dismissed her because of her gray hair and her cardigan. He realized that while he had been busy acting important, this woman had been building a legacy he couldn't even imagine. He looked at her face, peaceful and serene, and he felt a sudden urge to stand up and apologize, but he couldn't move. The music pinned him to his chair. The piece wasn't just about speed. It had a melody, a beautiful, haunting tune that weaved through the difficult runs. It was like a voice singing in the middle of a storm. The old woman brought out that melody, making it sing loud and clear, cutting through the flurry of notes around it. She was telling a story without words. It was a story of youth, of struggle, of things lost and things found. She poured the memories of a lifetime into those keys. As she approached the middle section, the music became even more demanding. The jumps became wider, the intervals more dangerous. It required a reach, a stretch that would have pulled a muscle in a lesser player. But she didn't pull back. She leaned into it, her body swaying slightly with the rhythm, moving with the music rather than fighting against it. The silence in the room was now absolute. It wasn't just quiet. It was listening. You could hear the air conditioner humming in the background, a low, mechanical drone that seemed pathetic compared to the sound pouring from the stage. The audience was holding its collective breath. It felt like if they breathed too loud, they might break the spell. They weren't just watching a performance anymore. They were witnessing a resurrection. The legend in the corner wasn't just playing a song. She was showing them who she really was. And for the first time that night, everyone was finally paying attention. The music didn't just stay in the room. It seemed to take over the very air everyone was breathing. By the time the woman reached the middle section of the piece, the initial shock of her speed had faded into something much deeper. The audience was no longer watching an old lady play a piano. They were watching a master at work. The difficult, flickering notes at the beginning were giving way to something heavier, more demanding. The piano was now singing, not just speaking. The change in the woman was physical and impossible to ignore. Earlier, she had looked like a fragile grandmother who might need help crossing the street. Now, sitting on that bench, her spine was straight as a rod. The cardigan that looked so baggy and loose before suddenly seemed to hang on a frame of steel. The tremor in her hands, the one that made her teacup rattle in the back row, was gone. It had vanished the moment her fingers touched the keys, placed by a precision that was almost scary. In the third row, the teenagers who had been laughing were deadly silent. The boy with the varsity jacket stopped looking at his phone entirely. He knew a little about the piano. He took lessons twice a week. He knew that what she was doing was supposed to be impossible for someone with hands that stiff and old. He watched her left hand crossing over her right, stretching wide to hit notes that were far apart. He saw the tension in her knuckles, the white, tight grip of a person fighting against the limits of the instrument. He realized that the easy look she had was a lie. It was actually incredibly hard. But she was so strong that she made it look weightless. The judges were in a state of panic. Mr. Vance, the man who had treated her like a joke, had slid forward so far in his chair that he was practically falling off. His face was pale. He was a pianist, or at least he used to be, and he knew the piece she was playing. He knew the transcendental etudes were considered some of the hardest music ever written for the instrument. He had tried to learn one in college and failed. And here was this woman, whom he had assumed couldn't read music well, playing it with more soul and fire than he had ever mustered in his life. He felt a hot flush of shame rise up his neck. He looked at the sheet music on the stand, then at her hands. She wasn't even looking at the paper anymore. She was playing from memory. The sound in the room was changing too. The acoustics of the community center were not great. Usually the piano sounded dull like a box of wet cardboard. But under her hands, the instrument was glowing. She was finding the resonance in the wood, the vibrations that rang in the iron plate. She played a series of descending runs, notes tumbling down the scale like a waterfall of diamonds. It was so fast that it sounded like one long fluid tone rather than separate notes. The sound washed over the audience, making the hair on their arms stand up. The piece. Faux Follets is named after ghost lights, the flickering flames that lead travelers astray in swamps. The music was supposed to feel elusive, dancing away just when you tried to catch it. The woman captured that perfectly. Her touch was light, feather-light, barely kissing the keys before dancing away to the next octave. But then, suddenly, she would strike a bass note with force, grounding the music, reminding everyone of the power behind the ghostliness. It was a musical roller coaster. She was driving it with her eyes closed. A small child in the second row, who had been fussy and squirming in his mother's lap, suddenly went still. He stared at the woman's hands, mesmerized by the movement. The music spoke a language that didn't need words. It was pure magic to him. The mother, shushing the child a moment ago, stopped and watched the woman too, her mouth slightly open. She had come to watch her own daughter play a simple song later, but now she realized she was seeing something much rarer. Up on stage, sweat was beginning to gather on the woman's forehead. A single droplet ran down her temple, catching the stage light as it fell. Her breathing was deep and rhythmic. You could see her chest rising and falling under her cardigan. It was a physical workout, as demanding as sprinting or lifting heavy weights, but she controlled it perfectly. She wasn't fighting the piano. She was partnering with it. She was leaning into the difficult passages, using the weight of her shoulders to drive the loud chords, then pulling back instantly for the soft, delicate whispers. The atmosphere in the hall had shifted from boredom to reverence. It felt like a church in the middle of a sermon. No one coughed. No one shifted in their seats. The silence between the phrases of the music was as heavy as the sound itself. The audience was scared to break the spell. They felt like if they made a noise, the magic would vanish, and the old woman would turn back into a nobody. The teenager in the varsity jacket looked at his friend. They didn't say anything, but they exchanged a glance that said it all. They were witnessing greatness. They realized that all the things they cared about, their phones, their clothes, their popularity, meant absolutely nothing in the face of this kind of talent. This was real. This was raw. This was a human being pushing themselves to the absolute limit. It was beautiful. The music moved into a section that was technically terrifying. It required the hands to jump in opposite directions, crossing over each other again and again. It was a mess of notes on the page, a knot that seemed impossible to untie. The woman didn't even blink. Her hands were like two independent birds, swooping and diving around each other without ever colliding. The sound was chaotic but organized, a storm that she controlled with an iron will. Mr. Vance felt a lump form in his throat. He thought about his own life, the shortcuts he had taken, the arrogance he carried. He looked at the sheet music he had carelessly tossed onto the rack. He had treated her with disrespect because of how she looked. He had assumed that because she was old and quiet, she had nothing to offer. He felt small. He felt like a fraud sitting at the judge's table, pretending to be an expert while a real expert sat on the stage and showed him how it was done. The woman's face was a picture of concentration.
Ow.
But it wasn't a struggle. Her eyes were closed, her head tilted slightly to the right. She was listening. She was listening to the ring of the piano, the decay of the notes, the way the sound bounced off the back wall. She was conducting the sound with her hands, shaping every phrase like a sculptor molding clay. She wasn't just hitting the right notes. She was giving the music life. She was making the piano cry and laugh in the same breath, The complexity of the piece was rising, building toward a climax. The notes were getting higher, faster, more intense. The audience leaned in, unconsciously pulling forward in their seats. It felt like they were watching a high-wire act without a net. The tension was almost unbearable. Everyone was waiting, breath held, to see if she would fall, to see if the facade would crack and the old lady would reappear. But she didn't crack. She only got stronger. The music swelled, filling the dusty hall with a sound so rich and powerful that it seemed to shake the dust from the rafters. She was no longer just a volunteer filling time. She was the mistress of the room. She owned every single person in that audience. They were hers, completely and totally, held captive by the beauty and the power of what she was creating. The legend was real, and for the first time in decades, she was letting the world see it. The hardest part of the piece wasn't the speed. It wasn't the jumps or the stretches or the blindingly fast runs that had already left the audience gasping. The hardest part was what came next. The quiet, desperate climb toward the end, where the music demanded everything the player had left. It was like climbing a mountain in the dark, knowing that one slip would send you tumbling all the way back down. The old woman's face was glistening now. A fine sheen of sweat covered her forehead and upper lip, catching the light of the stage. Her silver hair, usually so neat and tidy, was beginning to fall loose from its bun, a stray strand sticking to her cheek. But she did not stop to brush it away. Her entire being was focused on the keys, as if her life depended on the next 10 seconds. To the untrained ear, the music sounded beautiful, almost magical. But to the judges and the students in the front row, it sounded like a battle. The piano was fighting back. The notes were clustered so closely together that there was almost no room for her fingers. She had to be perfect. One hesitation, 1 millisecond off, and the spell would break. The tension in the room was thick enough to choke on. The teenager with the varsity jacket was gripping his knees so hard his knuckles turned white. He was physically leaning forward, his mouth open, terrified that she was going to crash. But she didn't crash. She soared. As the music reached its climax, the woman's posture changed again. She didn't hunch over the keyboard like a tired student. She threw her shoulders back, lifting her chin. Her hands came down on the keys with a force that seemed impossible for someone so frail. The sound that exploded from the piano wasn't a bang. It was a roar. It was a sound of triumph, of defiance, of pure, unadulterated power. The shockwave hit the audience like a physical force. The woman in the front row with the sharp glasses actually jumped in her seat. In that moment, the woman on the bench wasn't in a community center anymore. The walls of the auditorium seemed to dissolve. In her mind, she was young again. She was 20 years old, wearing a long velvet gown, standing in the center of a vast, glittering hall in Vienna. She could smell the expensive perfume and the cigars. She could hear the hushed whispers of the critics who had come to destroy her. The men who said that women didn't have the strength for Liszt, that music was a man's world. She remembered the fear she felt back then. The trembling hands, the feeling that she wasn't good enough. She remembered the years of silence that followed, the years of teaching children who didn't care, the years of watching her dreams gather dust in the corner. She remembered the loneliness of a life spent playing for empty rooms. She felt every rejection, every disappointment, every heartbreak she had ever suffered, and she poured all of it into the piano. She played with an anger that was terrifying and beautiful. She was shouting at the world without saying a word. She was proving to every person who had ever doubted her that she was still here. She was still a force to be reckoned with. The notes were sharp and cutting, slashing through the air like knives. Then, just as quickly, they turned soft and pleading, full of a sorrow that made the audience want to weep. It was a conversation with the past, reconciliation with the ghosts that had haunted her for 50 years. The teenager in the third row watched, mesmerized. He didn't understand the history, but he understood the emotion. He could feel her anger and her sadness vibrating through the floorboards. He realized for the first time that music wasn't just about hitting the right notes. It was about telling the truth. He looked at his own hands, resting uselessly in his lap, and felt a spark of something he had never felt before: respect. not just for her but for the art itself. He realized he had been treating the piano like a toy, while she treated it like a weapon. The music began to slow down. The furious storm of notes was receding, pulling back like a tide leaving the shore. The woman's hands moved to the high end of the keyboard, playing notes that were delicate and high, like stars twinkling in a night sky. The sound was so quiet that the audience had to lean in to hear it. It was a fragile sound, a vulnerable sound. It was the sound of an old soul laying down its burden. The judges were stunned. Mr. Vance had completely forgotten about his role as the head judge. He wasn't judging her. He was worshiping her. He saw the technique, the flawless precision, but he also saw the raw human spirit pouring out of her. He realized that he had never actually heard music before. He had only heard people playing notes. This was different. This was life being lived out loud. He felt a deep sense of shame for his arrogance, but he also felt a profound sense of gratitude. He knew he would remember this moment for the rest of his life. The sweat was dripping from the woman's chin now, falling onto the keys, but she didn't wipe it away. Her arms were aching, her fingers were cramping, and her lungs were burning for air. But she pushed through the pain. She was running on pure adrenaline and memory. Her body was old and tired, but her spirit was young and fire. She was flying. Then came the final run. It was a series of descending chords, cascading down the keyboard like a grand staircase. She played them with a rhythm that was rock solid, a heartbeat of sound that drove the piece to its end. The sound was rich and full, filling the entire room. It was the sound of a door slamming shut, the sound of a chapter ending, the sound of a victory finally won. She struck the last chord. It wasn't a loud, crashing ending. It was a deep, resonant bass note that seemed to come from the center of the earth. She held it, letting the sound ring out, letting it hang in the air like a heavy curtain. Her hands were frozen on the keys, pressed down with all her remaining strength. She held the pose, her head bowed, her chest heaving. The silence that followed was different from the silence before. It wasn't an empty silence. It was a full silence. It was a silence packed with emotion, with shock, with awe. The sound of the piano seemed to vibrate in the walls, in the floor, in the bones of everyone listening. No one moved. No one breathed. It was as if time had stopped. The teenager forgot to blink. A tear rolled down the cheek of the mother in the second row. The judges sat motionless, afraid that even the rustle of a shirt might break the spell. The old woman sat there for a long time, her hands still on the keys, her eyes closed. She wasn't playing anymore. She was just listening to the echo of what she had done. She was saying goodbye to the music, goodbye to the moment, and perhaps goodbye to the girl she used to be. Slowly, painfully, she lifted her hands from the keys. The moment her fingers left the ivory, the silence rushed back in, heavy and absolute. She dropped her hands into her lap and sat up straight. Her face was wet with tears and sweat, but her expression was peaceful. The battle was over. She had won. For maybe 5 seconds, the silence in the room was absolute. It was the kind of quiet that feels heavy, like the air before a thunderstorm. The last note of the piano had faded away, but the feeling it left behind hung in the dusty air like smoke. No one moved. No one breathed. The teenager in the third row was still leaning forward, his mouth slightly open, his hands gripping his knees. The judges were frozen, their pens forgotten on the table. Even the little child in the second row was staring wide-eyed, sensing that something incredible had just happened. Then, a sound broke the spell. It was the sharp, squeaky noise of a folding chair snapping open in the back row. But it wasn't someone leaving. An elderly man, a music teacher who had been silent all evening, stood up. He didn't clap at first. He just stood there, looking at the stage with immense respect. Slowly, another person stood up. Then another. Within moments, the entire audience was on its feet. The applause didn't just start. It exploded. It wasn't the polite clapping forth a kid's noise from earlier. It was a roar of genuine admiration, a wave of sound that washed over the stage. People were cheering, whistling, and shouting, "Bravo!" The teenagers in the front row weren't smirking anymore. They were clapping so hard their hands were turning red, looking at the woman with a newfound sense of awe. The judges were in chaos. Mr. Vance, the head judge, had turned bright red. He looked from the cheering crowd to the woman on the bench, completely flustered. The arrogance he had worn like a suit of armor earlier was shattered. He scrambled out from behind the table, nearly knocking over his chair, toward the stage, followed closely by the woman with the glasses. They didn't walk. They practically ran. They had treated her like a nobody, and now they realized they had been in the presence of a giant. They wanted to be the first to congratulate her, to shake her hand, to be associated with this miracle. Someone shouted from the side of the stage. It was the assistant who had fetched the music earlier. "We don't even know her name." On stage, the old woman sat very still amidst the thunderous noise. She didn't look surprised by the standing ovation, but she didn't look like she was enjoying it either. She looked tired. A deep exhaustion seemed to settle into her bones now that the adrenaline was fading. Her hands, which had been so strong and precise just moments ago, were resting quietly in her lap. The tremble had returned to her fingers, subtle but visible. Mr. Vance reached the stage steps, breathless. That was extraordinary," he stammered, leaning over the edge of the stage. "Absolutely breathtaking. Please, ma'am, what is your name? Where did you study? We must have a record of this. You have to play for the finals. We can get you a better piano, a proper hall." The other judge was right behind him, nodding frantically. "Yes, yes. The technique, the tone. It's been years since I've heard Liszt played like that. Are you a retired professor? Do you have students?" The questions came fast, tumbling over one another. The crowd quieted down slightly, leaning in to hear her answer. They all wanted to know who she was. They wanted to put a label on her, to give her a title, to understand how a woman who looked like a sweet grandmother could command a piano, like a general commanded an army. The woman slowly lifted her head. She looked at the judges, but her gaze wasn't angry or proud. It was soft, almost sad. She saw their desperation, their need to claim credit for her talent, their sudden change of heart now that they knew she was good. She saw the irony of it all. She didn't reach for the microphone. She didn't stand up to take a bow. She simply looked at Mr. Vance and offered a small, knowing smile. It was the kind of smile a parent gives a child who has finally learned a lesson after making a mistake. "Thank you for the music," she said softly. Her voice was raspy, barely audible over the murmur of the crowd. But it carried a weight of finality. Mr. Vance blinked, confused. "But your name? Surely you want us to announce you?" The woman shook her head gently. She didn't want an announcement. She didn't want a trophy or a certificate. She hadn't played to win. She hadn't played to prove them wrong, not really. She had played because the music was inside her, and for a few glorious minutes, she had let it out. She had reclaimed a piece of herself that she thought she had lost. That was enough. With slow, deliberate movements, she reached out and closed the sheet music. She didn't take the pages with her. She left them on the stand, the notes that had tormented students for generations, sitting innocently on the rack. She placed her hands on the keys one last time, not to play, but to say goodbye, patting the cold wood of the piano like an old friend. Then she stood up. Her knees cracked again, the sound loud in the sudden hush of the room. She smoothed down her skirt and buttoned the top of her cardigan. The transformation was complete. The legend on the bench was gone, replaced once again by the quiet old lady from the back row. She walked toward the stairs where the judges were waiting. Mr. Vance stepped forward, hand outstretched, ready to introduce himself properly. But the woman didn't take his hand. She brushed past him with a lightness of step that seemed impossible for her age. She didn't even look back at the crowd. "Wait, please," someone else shouted from the audience. But she didn't stop. She walked down the steps, her worn shoes clicking softly on the floor. She walked through the center aisle, the crowd parting like the Red Sea to let her pass. People reached out, wanting to touch her sleeve, wanting to shake her hand, wanting some of her magic to rub off on them. But she kept her eyes forward, focused on the double doors at the back of the hall. The teenage boy watched her go, a strange feeling in his chest. He realized he would never see her again, and he would never know who she was. She would remain a mystery, a ghost who floated into their lives, showed them what true passion looked like, and then vanished. He felt a sudden urge to run after her, to ask her to teach him, but he stayed in his seat. He knew that some things couldn't be taught. They had to be felt as she pushed open the heavy doors and stepped out into the cool evening air. The noise of the auditorium was cut off behind her. The sound of applause started up again inside, confused and cheering, but she didn't hear it. Outside, the sun was setting, casting long shadows across the parking lot. The air was crisp and smelled like rain. She stood on the sidewalk for a moment, taking a deep breath, filling her lungs with the fresh air. She felt lighter than she had in years. Her fingers ached, her back hurt, and she was incredibly tired. But her heart was full. She adjusted her bag on her shoulder and began the slow walk home. She didn't need the applause. She didn't need the judges to tell her she was good. She had known who she was all along. And tonight, for a brief and shining moment, she had been able to show the world. She walked away into the twilight, leaving the community center behind her. Just a solitary figure with silver hair and a heart full of music, disappearing into the night.